Welcome, Darlene.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to speak.
I'm so happy to have you because I've been following you for a while. And so I want to jump right into, I recall a story in your book where because you found out you were codependent, you switched careers from a law career to a career as a therapist. So I was just wondering what exactly happened that led you to recognize your codependent tendencies.
Well, back in the day, we didn't call it
Right.
codependency particularly. That's was more. I mean, the term originated in the 70s, but it wasn't that widespread.
Okay.
And I was attending Al-Anon meetings, and no one discussed codependency there, but we had all those symptoms. And so I was more working on my assertiveness, my self-esteem.
Okay.
I wasn't worrying about labels. Originally, codependency came out of research with alcoholics and their families. And the original term was co-alcoholics. And then they discovered that that even after an alcoholic got sober, that the characteristics and behavior of their spouses continued. And then they even discovered that they pre-existed the marriage. And then further research showed that it stemmed from dysfunctional family environment. If you had an ill, depressed parent, the other situations. And then they started looking at more the family structure and dysfunctional family systems.
Is there something in your life that where you, well, I guess when you said that you realized you weren't assertive and stuff, you were displaying the traits without knowing. That's what.
Right. I was in an abusive relationship.
Okay. That's what I meant. Okay. And so now, how did you link codependency and shame in your work?
Well, I was helping people with all of their symptoms, both as a result of clinical experience and my training and research and my own experience. And then around 2011, Wiley Publications asked me to, well, I guess it was before that, because I had written a blog on codependency. I don't really remember exactly when I started thinking about the term.
Okay.
But it sort of coalesced when Wiley asked me to write a blog on a book, Codependency for Dummies. And they asked me to compete with some other therapists or authors. And I was thinking, all of my work was about that. I had written a blog on it, which they found. And so this was pretty familiar to me. And I did an outline for to submit to them. And it was very comprehensive. And they immediately offered me the assignment to write the book. And then Hazelton, have you heard of them?
Yes, the treatment center, yes.
Right, and they publish a lot of the literature on the 12 steps and addiction, and Melody Beatty has written for them, and they asked me to write a book on shame and codependency.
Okay.
My book on Codependency for Dummies, so then I started writing that book. And then my work with clients really exponentially speeded up because I was able to really zero in on the core symptom, which was shame, and treat that. And then healing started much faster.
Oh, okay. Now, actually, from reading your book, I realized that I harbored a lot of shame throughout my life that I never acknowledged. And I got the impression that recognizing how big a part that emotion has played in my acceptance of codependent abuse and neglect,
Right.
it's something that's kind of common for all of us, isn't it?
Well, shame is a natural emotion.
Okay.
So you can't really get rid of it, but you don't want it to be toxic, they say, or internalized. And that when that happens, it's usually stemming from childhood. And with some people, it's not that conscious.
Right.
But with other people, they feel ashamed all the time. They feel inferior all the time. You can tell by their posture um, and the way they talk about themselves. And other people could be very successful and accomplished and not think that they have any shame. An extreme case of that might be a narcissist, but they do have shame underneath. And then when something happens, like they make a mistake in public, or they think they made a fool of themselves, acting silly, they forget a birthday, a name of someone, they feel like mortified. So when something happens that kind of cracks their veneer of feeling confident, all the shame like really comes out, and they might ruminate over it for a day and not be able to let go, or they might have excessive guilt. Fear comes from shame and guilt. Those are all signs of deep internalized shame.
So explain now, we all understand that shame can play a useful role in our behavior, in keeping us kind of in check. So what's the difference between that shame and toxic shame? And how does it show up? Like, can you give me examples of how it shows up in relationships?
Okay, well, it permeates relationships, but if you don't have shame, you might behave in a way that you see some public figures act. You can imagine, like, how would they possibly do something so shamelessly, like our former president, and not even cross, not bother them at all.
Right.
So, it keeps you from defecating on the street and
right.
talking on your cell phone at a funeral, or things like that, that's inappropriate behavior. Guilt is more associated with moral behavior. So you think that immoral.
Right.
But, it overlaps. So
now when we're talking about codependency and addiction and family relationships, one thing we know is that addicts they use people who are abusing alcohol or drugs. Shame is at the root of some of what the pain that they're trying to overcome, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And so there's something called avowing shame. Okay. So for instance, an alcoholic will think, well, yeah, I know I should stop. Well, I'm just going to like binge this weekend, have a long drunk. And then he'll really feel ashamed, and that kind of motivates him to get well. Or sometimes people act out and they're very promiscuous or something. And it's sort of like their unconscious is pushing them to behave in such a reckless way that then the shame, then they will correct themselves. I want to answer your question about how it shows up in relationships.
Yeah, because my impression is that, say the alcoholic who drinks and then feels ashamed but can't stop drinking. So shame kind of piles up on shame on top of shame. And then how does that affect how they deal with their families?
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack in that question, because the behavior, the shame will drive behavior that makes you feel more ashamed.
Right.
Okay, so then you're too ashamed to get help.
Right.
A lot of people don't go to counseling or a 12-step program because they're too ashamed.
Yes.
It takes a certain amount of courage and support to even reach out to help, because asking help can be in someone's mind a sign of weakness.
Yes.
And if they were ashamed for asking for things or showing any weakness, for instance, that's one reason a narcissist would rarely would seek therapy. So I know that could keep people from getting help. And so it's a negative feedback loop. Okay. So if you get into recovery, you start feeling better and you think more positively of yourself. And then it raises your self-esteem, your behaviors improve, and it's a positive feedback loop. So our thinking plays a big role in this. And wait a second, your question then was about, I'm sorry, I forgot.
So now the family is also feeling shame. Parents may feel ashamed that their child is on drugs, but also they may be so codependent in that relationship that they don't seek the help of Al-Anon or Codependency Anonymous.
Oh, for sure.
So there's again that feedback loop encircles the whole family.
Well,
shame.
it's it's a shame-based family system. When there's addiction, when there's criminality, sometimes if there's mental illness, and so the shame, and even it's interesting that sometimes parents have secrets they don't share with their children that they're ashamed of, but the children feel it anyway. And so it gets transmitted even transgenerationally without speaking. It's like unspoken shame.
Wow.
So you're talking about enabling. For myself, when my husband sought help in AA, and I guess the person he reached out to, their wife contacted me. I can't quite remember, and took me to an Al-Anon meeting. And I heard there that I played a part in that I should continue going to meetings and that I needed to change. And I thought, that's absurd. He's the one with the addiction.
Yes, that's
There's nothing wrong with me. I don't need, I was being abused. I didn't.
Yes.
I thought he's the one with the problem. There's a lot of denial, and denial is the first hurdle for both an addict and a codependent. I have people contact me, say, I really want to help this person. How do I help them? I don't have a problem, but they're codependent.
Yes.
They're obsessed with helping someone else. So they told me, well, it'll help your husband if you come. So that was the hook.
Okay.
I think it took me 3 years.
Yes, it took me a while.
Really focus on myself.
Yes, it took me a while too. I really resented having to go.
Oh yeah.
When he wouldn't go. But now, from reading your book, I realized there was more shame in that for me than I recognized until reading your book, actually.
Well, to be honest with you, it was some years after the divorce and many years after being in Al-Anon, and I was at the time teaching about self-esteem.
Okay.
And I was unaware that I had shame underneath that.
Yes.
So actually it came to me in a dream, which I mentioned in the book. Yeah. And eventually things led me to start psychoanalysis. And then I learned more about and started correcting that shame. So there's shame-based, it's pretty widespread and common. People don't talk about it.
No.
And it'll show up by people have intimacy issues. That's a common trait of codependency. And often the reason is shame. They're afraid of exposing themselves. They're afraid of being authentic. And you can't really have intimacy unless you're really honest and quote unquote, like emotionally naked with someone.
Yes, yes.
And then the relationship really comes alive. But when you have shame underneath, it inhibits your assertiveness. Yeah. You don't want to be direct. You don't want to reveal yourself. And so you can't have real intimacy. You have trouble saying no because you're afraid of being left. You're afraid of being criticized. There's like a whole panoply series of consequences to shame. And then your self-esteem is compromised, and relationships, when you have healthier self-esteem, last longer. There's like research on that.
Yes,
so
yes.
Start to accommodate your partner, and then you hold in resentments. You're not honest with them. You don't set boundaries. There's just like so many symptoms.
So many symptoms. Yes, yes. And that reminds me of, I also had an alcoholic father. And in reading a book, I recognized, of course, it was embarrassing to me that he would have alcohol on his breath and stuff. But until now, I didn't realize that my shame about that went deeper, that my mother and his mother they kind of made fun of him, like behind his back. You know, that was in the days when we didn't know nearly as much. So they thought it was a moral failure and a weakness. But in hindsight, I recognize that was their shame
Oh
that
yeah,
they were expressing.
right. I talk about in my book, Conquering Shame, about other shame. So people will be ashamed of being seen with someone who's drunk.
Yes.
But actually they're borrowing. It's not, they have nothing to be ashamed of, but they're feeling ashamed because someone close to them uh, is acting inappropriately.
And as a
So,
child, that's a lot. Children are going through that, right?
well, right. And then an alcoholic or anyone who's abusive and controlling is going to be shaming your feelings or be critical.
Yeah.
Or you shouldn't cry or act like a lady, or commonly you can't get, it's not, you're allowed to be angry.
Yeah.
Pride is sinful. There's so many different emotions that could be shamed in the family or even indirectly. Mm-hmm. So it starts in actually toddlerhood or infancy.
Wow.
So if a parent is not mirroring you because they're shut down, depressed, an addict, or just not attuned to you because of their own insecurity, then the baby and the toddler will start accommodating to the parent, to the mother.
Yes.
So if you're laughing and smiling and your mother is depressed and showing a sad face, then there's not that mirroring there, and so you start not being who you are and start. This is how codependency is born, like a false self.
Exactly. We're kind of trying to manage things as children that's not for us to manage. And that's the codependency, right? Trying to get your mother to be happy when she's not, when that's not your responsibility as a child.
Right. Or not even do that, just squelch your own feelings and happiness. Or if your needs aren't attended to.
Yes.
Or your natural instincts are somehow limited. So there's just so many ways that a parent shame you by not mirroring you, by not meeting your needs, by ignoring a child's requests for help, or ignoring their pain, or even well-meaning parents. So a child comes home from school and they tell their parents they were bullied and how bad they feel, and the parent says, well, don't be ashamed. You shouldn't feel that way. Okay. So that's shaming, because it says you shouldn't feel that way. I remember in my own childhood that I had a girlfriend who was a real tomboy. I wasn't. He was climbing trees, and I was so upset because she was doing it with another girl, and I was afraid I was going to lose my best friend. Oh. And I remember saying, well, I think my mother just laughed, and she says, oh, that's for the birds. You don't need to climb trees. So I just, like, you shouldn't feel it. Don't feel that way.
Yeah, not acknowledging your feelings.
Right, right.
And making you feel ashamed for having those feelings.
I know that I shouldn't feel afraid, or I shouldn't be sad, or
now. So how is that? So now, can that also lead a child as they grow up, those shameful moments that are discounted? Can that contribute to them abusing substances at some point?
Well, I don't know about a specific emotion, but often there's also a genetic component. Okay. And there's also behavior. So if they're seeing a parent drink, but it does get passed on generationally also. The research is not complete in that area, but if a child is lacking attention from a parent and that mirroring and love, they will try to get their needs met or also cope with their pain by turning to drugs or alcohol or promiscuity or other things like that. Just like some children will just stays at the computer all day long because they're not
Okay.
getting interaction and support and intimacy from a parent. And by the way, it's not enough that a parent just says, I love you all day long. They could say it, but if
Mm.
they don't accept you for who you are, if your love is conditional, like,
Yes.
well, I love you, but you need to get good grades or else you're scolded or something. Or if you're a boy, you really should be playing sports.
I've only realized since my children are grown that I'm guilty of that. Sadly, I thought it was love, but and I thought it was, we think it's like I want the best for you, so you
Yes.
better bring home those good grades. But I realize now, no, that wasn't so good. But one thing, I also something you said that brought to mind when children grow up with alcoholic or addicted parents, we always think that that's the reason. And sometimes they tell themselves, I'll never be like that. And then they end up following that addictive pattern. Isn't it like they were ashamed of their parent and yet they still fell into the same addictions? How does that work?
Well, we often do what we say we're not going to do, or err by doing the opposite. So if you have a parent that's too strict, you might be too lenient with your children, or your
Okay.
parent is neglectful and then or abusive, and then you're overly controlling and go the opposite way. But if they have an alcoholic parent, they often have the same problems of a dysfunctional family that might lead them to drink.
Okay,
So
so it's the dysfunction and
plus it could be a hereditary proclivity for addiction. Now they did research that show that people that feel the effects of alcohol immediately usually don't become addicts.
really.
Yeah, and the people that can, they can hold their liquor, so to speak, they often become alcoholics because they don't get high right away, so they keep drinking. So that's probably a genetic component of like how susceptible they are to the influence of alcohol and how quickly they react.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
So they might have, think I'm not going to be like my dad or mom or something and drink, but just drink socially, but not realize that they have that tendency, and then it helps them feel better. It helps them feel more confident. Then they drink more, and little by little they become addicted, maybe unknowingly, or there's some crisis, and they turn to alcohol.
So now would that person, once they realize they have a problem, would they feel more shame because they grew up in it and now here they are? So, I mean, are there multiples of shame? I don't know how to say that.
Well, there's, I wouldn't generalize. I'd say everybody's unique. I mean, they might think,
Okay.
oh, I'm turning into my parent, and so I'm going to get help right away. So they may not
Oh,
necessarily avoid help. And yeah, there's many things you can be shamed for. As I said, your looks, your emotions, your needs, your interests.
yes.
So
So, okay, because also shame and codependency, people definitely don't recognize codependency unless we're in situations with family dysfunction. And even then, we have to be educated to it. But how many families are having codependent relations and don't recognize it? Like, is that a large part of the population? Is that everybody? Is that, can you be codependent
I would say
without
it's
coming
large.
from
Uh,
dysfunction?
well, I would say it's very large, but I wouldn't start to guess a number. And just let me say that it's a very Western idea.
Okay.
So I I write in the book on shame and codependency for dummies also that this is a very Western individualistic approach because in collectivist countries, in the Middle East, in South America, in Asia, many parts of Asia, that the how you behave is considered reflecting on the whole family. And the families, we would look at
Yes.
them as a mesh.
Yes.
But we're having a very kind of Western, European, American point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might say, well, all those countries, they're codependent, but that's the norm there. So, that's a cultural difference. And it's a big problem. I've had clients come to me that their parents are immigrant and they have generational conflicts because their parents are expecting them to behave in ways that that they want, and the children want to be more Western and
Yes.
independence, and they feel totally drawn into the family system where everybody is in everybody's business and everybody talks about everybody, and they use in those cultures they use shame overtly.
Yes.
In Western countries, they more or less use guilt, but there's for instance, in South Korea, there's a very high suicide rate for young high school students that don't get into college.
Yes.
Don't pass their exams because they feel like it's a shame on the whole family.
That was a big surprise in your book when I read about the different nationalities and how things are handled in different cultures. It was very, very enlightening, to say the least.
Yeah, and I have examples from clients that were raised in Mexico, and they didn't do well on a test, and they were put in front of the room, and all the students were told to shame this person.
Wow.
And thinking that would make them study more. And it turned out the reason that it was because of problems at home is why my client wasn't doing well in the exams. And then I've had clients that are from the Soviet Union. And it not only was shame used in the family, it's used nationally. Yeah. So a big banner was put up on side of the high school to shame my client.
Oh my goodness.
Publicly shaming.
Wow. So is that effective? Can it be? I mean,
well, it might curb the person's behavior. I mean, that's when you think about it, even going back in the early, United States, when you think about thinking about the book, The Scarlet Letter.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and religious groups will shame people or exclude them.
Yes, they will. But my question to you as a therapist is that a healthy approach?
No, it's not. And actually, no, it's not. And even in with criminals, punishing criminals with shame is counterproductive. Okay. And in my book, I go through the list of differences between guilt and shame. And guilt is actually can help you build your self-esteem. Because guilt gives you empathy for others. It's instead of, there's something wrong with me, it's like my behavior was wrong. And so I can change my behavior. So it leads to self-improvement. Yes. And reaching out to make amends and self-correction. And shame, on the other hand, makes you feel like I'm irredeemable. And it makes you withdraw and want to hide. And it leads to aggression and addiction and suicidality and depression. And whereas guilt can make you want to change and improve and help others. So.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. So Darlene, we're running out of time. So my last question is, do you have any advice? What's your advice for families? Say if they're dealing with an alcoholic adult child whose shame seems to be the main thing that's the block from them getting help or from the family supporting them, what do you tell them?
Well, the first thing is to get information.
Okay.
That you have to come out of denial. One of the biggest problems in dysfunctional families is not just denial, but it's a closed system. Whereas a healthy company, a healthy family, a healthy country is a free flow of information. It's not closed down like with propaganda,
Okay.
from the top. So there's, free speech. So the same thing in a family, there's information come in, so you don't feel like you have to hide everything. That's when it's the same with, there's no addiction, but there's abuse. And so the victim usually wants, certainly the abuser and the victim wants to hide and feel humiliated and keep it a secret.
Okay.
That's the first thing, is to get information, reach out for help. And then, work on your own self-esteem and shame. And that's one way to helping others. And you can be supportive, but have boundaries. So a lot of codependents think, oh, it's unloving if I have boundaries. Not so.
Not so.
So you have to have boundaries for a relationship to work with your children, with your mate. And so you have boundaries that are not shaming, but are just loving, like the consequence. If you do this, then this will happen. It's not about you being a bad person. This is the natural consequence of this behavior is not going to be acceptable.
And would you say not allowing shame to keep anybody in the family from getting the help they need, to be open to receiving help and asking for it if you need it, not feeling ashamed that you need it.
Yeah, and the first thing, for family members, go to Al-Anon. Run to Al-Anon.
Run to Al-Anon. Run to 12 step. I believe that 12 steps should be for everybody. I really do.
That's true. But the thing is, and by the way, I have an ebook called Spiritual Transformation.
Yes, I'm going to have, I have your list of all your books will be in the show notes.
And you don't have to be religious or anything. It's psycho-spiritual based. But what I was going to say is the first step is knowing you're powerless over the other person. And the first step of AA is like, I'm powerless over alcohol.
Yes.
For Coda, it's other people. So it's not something you can control, and don't shame yourself that you have an addicted child, or try to beat sobriety into your children. If you know that you have to be supportive, but that doesn't mean that you allow behavior that's not okay, but you continue to support them in, don't be surprised if they come home drunk, because that's what an alcoholic does. They drink.
Right, and don't shame them for it.
Don't shame them. When they have remorse, that's the time when you can say, would you like help?
Well, Darlene, we're out of time, but thank you so very much. And again, her book is entitled Conquering Shame and Codependency, 8 Steps to Freeing the True You.